Hey, what's going on out there? I'm Sean Devine. Hope you all are doing well. Today I've got a new video for you all, and we're going to talk about the top 5 mistakes that I made as a mixer when I was first starting out. Beginner mixing mistakes, and the reason why I want to point these out is because many of you may be making these same mistakes, maybe knowingly, maybe not knowingly, but I want to go ahead and identify them and then give you a couple of things to think about in terms of how you can fix it and moving forward so that you won't make the same mistakes, and hopefully not for as long as I made these mistakes, because I made them for many years before I finally figured out this is probably not the best way to do things. All right, so let's talk about the first mistake that I made most commonly as a beginner mixer, and it would be having a harsh high end. Now, whether this was with my instrumental tracks or in my vocal tracks. So for example here, what I would generally do in the beginning was, I would boost my high end very aggressively, as I'm doing here, which is what I like to do. I like a nice clean top end. But then I wasn't so precise with the de-esser. So either I wasn't doing enough de-essing or I was doing too much. And when you're not doing enough, it tends to give you a little bit harsher sibilance when you're boosting things that heavily. So let me just play this back without the de-esser on. And also I'm going to take off this radiator plugin, which I use a lot. You'll see I've got the treble turned down just maybe like a dB. And this just tends to give us a little bit of a warm kind of color that's going to smooth out some of that sibilance. So let's turn both of those plugins off, which are helping me out with the sibilance. And then there's also some compression that is doing the same thing. This Puig Child is kind of kissing things a little bit. So I'm going to turn that off. And let's play back this verse, and then I'm going to play it with those on so you can hear exactly what's happening.
I can see clearly now that I'm the beneficiary from the suffering and the scars that try to mar our experience here on earth. But what if Saul wasn't blinded? Who became party? Now remind them of all the greatness that's arisen from the struggle.
That's probably the tone that a lot of you are hearing when you're making this boost, which you've got to get that high end out of it, that crispness. But when you do this, you have to counteract that high boost with some things that are going to smooth it out. So when I turn those on,
I can see clearly now that I'm the beneficiary from the suffering and the scars that try to...
You can hear the de-essers going to work, and it's doing just enough attenuation where it's taking the harshness out of the S's, but we can still hear the S's and it doesn't sound like he has a lisp or anything like that. So if I turn that back,
I can see clearly now that I'm the beneficiary from the suffering and the scars that try to mar our experience.
Too harsh. If I do it too much,
I can see clearly now that I'm the beneficiary from the suffering and the scars that try to mar our experience here on earth.
it just muddies the whole vocal. So there's a sweet spot, and that is something that I had to practice a lot and get down, was again, just getting those sibilant frequencies to be a little bit warmer, a little more pleasing to the ear. All right, number 2 in the top mixing mistakes I made as a beginner was not having enough bass or low end. I was trying to control things too much. Now, this is probably the opposite of what the majority of you are dealing with. Most of you are trying to get too much bass, and you're turning your bass up really loud, and it's muddying up the mix. You're using bass enhancement plugins, and you're just pushing them way too hard. But my problem was I was in a room that was treated really well in terms of reflections and things like that. But in terms of bass response, the room was not giving me a very realistic portrayal of the bass. So what was happening was I was mixing it, and in my room the bass sounded great. It was full. You could feel it in your chest. But when I would leave my studio room, and this is again when I was first starting to get comfortable with mixing, there would be not enough bass in the car. People would comment that the mixes sounded a little bit thin. And that, again, it was just something with the room and the speakers I was using. So I had to learn how to compensate for that. So if it sounded really full in my room, I would pump the bass up just a little bit more so that when I go outside of the studio, it would sound the way it should. All right, number 3 in the top mixing mistakes I made as a beginner was making my snares and claps too loud. Now, this is something that I want to caution about because this is a preference of mine. I personally like snares and claps to be pretty loud. I grew up listening to producers like Dr. Dre, Timbaland, even rock guys like Andy Wallace, who mixed the snare very loud, so it's piercing. It's very, very, it has like the blink sort of reaction to it. And I like that. So you need to distinguish between things that are preferences. There's nothing incorrect about mixing a snare or a clap really loud, but I was to the point where it wasn't balanced right. It was just super loud for the sake of being loud, whereas I needed to pull it back so that it wasn't killing the rest of my mix and it wasn't distracting the listener from the rest of the mix, the vocals especially. So let me just play back what I have right now. And what I actually did in this mix was the snares were up about 3 or 4 dB louder than they are now, but I just pulled them back, again, knowing that the way I hear snares and claps is a little bit different than most.
Here on earth, but what if Saul wasn't blinded? Who became party, I remind them of all the
So in the context of the rest of the instrumentation here by AP, this snare sound works where it's at right now. But what I was doing was going up maybe to about this point. Which to me, again, I like the way that sounds, but with the vocal, it just starts to be a little bit of a distraction. So you got to balance it out, bring it back, and make sure that things are working together. You don't want things like that just for your own preference sake to take away from the total mix, because the mix is all about balance. It's all about complementing each other and having all these elements work in tandem. Number 4 on the top mixing mistakes I made as a beginner was I was pushing my stereo bus or my master bus too hard to the point of clipping, not distortion, but I was clipping it. And it was, I was knowingly doing this, but I wasn't doing any limiting. I was doing no processing on my stereo bus and my master bus. So a lot of the stuff that was going out here during that beginner phase with me had nothing on the stereo bus, and my mixes were really clean. They were really transparent. The dynamics and the transients were super punchy, and that's what I wanted. However, by doing that, it ultimately kind of hurt me in certain ways because I wasn't factoring the digital to analog conversion of when we go out of the DAW. So if those clips are happening on the stereo or the master bus, we bounce a file down. Once we get into the analog realm, that's where you start to hear things happen. And some of the sessions that I worked on initially, they went on to radio, they went on to television, and I heard those things, and I heard how the compressors that radio uses and things, they were seeing some of those extreme peaks, and that compression was happening, and it was affecting my transients and dynamics in the exact way that I didn't want it to, because I hadn't done those processes already. So it was having to overwork the compressor that was happening in that later stage. So now I have more of a balance where, especially if I'm the last person to be touching this session, if I'm mastering it, maybe I'm mastering it in the same session as the mix, I want to make sure that I'm keeping things below 0. We're not going into the red. I'm using things like True Peak to take into consideration the transition from digital to the analog realm, so we're not peaking. And we just want to make sure that all that stuff is happening here before we bounce, so that we don't have a lot of surprises later on, because that definitely was something that I was not aware of in the beginning. But don't worry too much about little bits of clipping on individual channels. Just make sure that you're not pushing the stereo bus too heavily, and that we make sure and tame those extreme peaks with something like a limiter maximizer to make sure that when we go into the analog realm, we're in good shape there. All right, y'all, you still with me? Number 5 in the top mixing mistakes I made as a beginner was I didn't utilize automation enough. And this may be something that you all are guilty of as well at this point. You have a tendency to feel like once you've properly compressed something like a vocal, or maybe you've got your instrumental mix, it's all balanced very well, that you don't really have to move everything, and you can just kind of leave everything static and let the mix run through, which is what I did. And there's nothing wrong with that. But again, the whole point of mixing is you want to make this song dynamic. You want to have some movement in it. And so automation is going to help you achieve that. Now, whether it's through automating effects or actually automating volumes. So just because your vocal is, nice and sitting up front doesn't mean that there's certain points where you might want to automate the volume a little bit. Maybe you want to make a certain part a little louder. It's okay to do that. Again, we're creating movement. We're directing the listener through the mix. And so now I am definitely utilizing automation. Hip hop, a lot of ad-libs, the way they're recorded, we've talked about it a little bit on the channel. Certain ad-libs are going to have totally different delivery than others, but they're recorded on the same track. So that's a perfect example of where we would want to use volume automation to make sure that some of those much quieter spaces in an ad-lib track, we're able to still catch them. You don't just put a compressor and process everything and expect it all to kind of sit properly. You're still going to have to do some automation. So I didn't do a lot of automation in the beginning, but I'm doing much more now. It's created a lot of movement. It's made my mixes more exciting. It's definitely taken things to the next level in terms of making my effects tracks more interesting. My echo throws, different types of effects that I introduce into the vocals. Those are the top 5 mixing mistakes I made as a beginner. If you're making these same mistakes, don't get discouraged. The reason why I made this video is to identify these mistakes that I clearly made, and these were the ones that affected my mixes in the most dramatic way and not a good way. And I wanted to bring them to your attention so that you can recognize if you are making these and you can correct them sooner than later, because again, I made these for too long, and now that I have implemented a lot of these things we talked about, the mixes have gone to the next level. So I want you to be able to get your mixes to the next level more quickly. If you have any questions about other mistakes that you may be making and solutions, feel free to leave a comment below. We've got a community on this channel that's very helpful. People are encouraging, and we all want to get that next level sound that your music deserves. If you learned anything in the video, please like, subscribe, and consider sharing, and we'll talk to you soon.
These seasons always gonna change. Nothing stays the same. I said move forward, gotta keep my head up.